Greetings to everybody. How are you all doing today? Now, in today's video, I want to discuss a controversial topic, and that has to do with the issue of apostasy in Islam. How are Muslims supposed to deal with this issue? And indeed, it is a very controversial topic. And in my last video, and even in the videos before it, I've been getting comments, even in private messaging, telling me to address this situation. So I thought I'd make a video to address it and clarify the matter for both the non-Muslims and the Muslims on this issue. And once everybody knows the real truth, then there shouldn't be any controversy to this topic. Now, from the get-go, let me state that I am of the opinion that apostates are not to be killed, and I believe I have the strong evidence on my side. In fact, there's a large number of Muslims, scholars, and so on, who take the position that I'm about to give you. So this is not talking from my own head, my own personal opinion. This is talking with facts, evidences, and the fact that scholars, many scholars, agree with my position. So now, let's get to the evidences, because that's what matters. It's evidence that matters. Now, if anybody has ever read the Quran, which is the holy book of the Muslims, if anybody has read this book, then they would see that in the second chapter of the Quran, it specifically teaches that the Muslims are not allowed to force anybody into our religion. As the Quran clearly says, there is no compulsion in religion. Islam explicitly forbids Muslims from forcing anybody into Islam. You know, you can't force anybody. Islam means willful submission with peace to God. You know, that's how it is. You can't force somebody into it. So Islam clearly teaches that. You can't force anybody into your religion. Now, if you can't force anybody into your religion, if I can't force you to become a Muslim, then I certainly can't force you to remain a Muslim. At the end of the day, these two things are the same thing. If you can't force somebody into it, then you sure as heck can't force somebody to remain in the religion. And that right there is one of the greatest and biggest evidences, and it makes perfect logical sense. Number two, if anybody ever reads the Quran, they will always see that God calls upon the Muslims to be sincere. That's what He wants. He wants sincere Muslims. He doesn't want fake Muslims who give off this fake image that they are Muslim, you know, pretending. God doesn't want that. Adding furthermore to this point, God also makes it clear that He doesn't need you. You need Him. So in other words, if you decide to stop worshipping Him, that's your own loss, not His. That's what the Quran clearly teaches. So when you put all of these things together, it means that if you're an apostate, then so be it. Because God wants sincere people, as He says in the Quran, and He also said He doesn't need you. You need Him. He is rich. He is all-powerful, etc. So if you decide to become an apostate, that's your own loss. So that's more evidence that, you know, it's not a death penalty for apostates. It's to their own loss, as the Quran says. You know, if you're not sincere, if you become an apostate, that's it. You know, that's your own loss. And now comes the biggest evidence, you know. The biggest and best evidence from the Quran is that it talks about apostasy. It's not like the Quran never talks about the issue. The Quran time and time again talks about apostates. And never once does the Quran command you to kill the apostate. Never once do you read a death penalty being passed for an apostate. There are many punishments in the Quran for sins. Many punishments. There are punishments for fornication, adultery, murder. But when it comes to apostasy, there is no punishment. The Quran talks about apostasy, but doesn't mention a punishment. In fact, every time you read a verse that talks about apostasy, you find that God says He will deal with them, and that's it. You know, it's their loss, He will deal with them, case closed. So that right there is the biggest evidence. The Quran mentions apostasy, and it never mentions a death penalty to accompany it. And if that's not the strongest proof that you shouldn't kill apostates, then I don't know what is. So let us summarize the evidences so far. Number one, the Quran says you can't force anybody into your religion. No compulsion in religion. So if you can't force somebody into your religion, you can't force them to stay in your religion. Number two, God wants sincere believers. And He also makes it clear that He doesn't need you, you need Him. So therefore this applies to apostates. If you're an apostate, then you're not sincere. God doesn't need you, so you're free to move on. Number three, the Quran talks about apostasy, and the Quran never mentions a punishment for apostates. And remember, the Quran mentions punishments for other sins. So why didn't it mention a punishment for apostasy? So that's the biggest proof right there. Now I've just given you the positive case. That's the positive case. Now let's go to the negative case. Now you see, we Muslims, we believe in the Quran and the Hadiths. Now if you don't know what the Hadiths are basically the prophetic traditions. They are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. They are the sayings of the Prophet and his companions. Basically they're written down. You know, people used to memorize the oral traditions and then they would write them down, and they are hadiths. And we still have them today. These are what they used to say to each other. Now, when somebody reads the hadiths, the traditions, one will read that the Prophet Muhammad used to command the death of apostates. It's clear in the hadiths. It says, whoever changes his religion, kill him. Now that might seem to indicate, well, that's the proof that you should kill apostates. No. For starters, you can't ignore everything I've just said. You can't ignore it. You have to take it into account, and then you have to harmonize it. So that's what we're going to do right now. Now, if anybody studies Islamic history, they will see that the first Muslims, when the Muslims left Mecca and went to Medina, the Muslims became a state. You know, they became a state. They had their own city, they had their own leadership, government, constitution. They were like a country. You know, it's not like early Christianity, when early Christianity wasn't a state with no power, no people. The early Muslims were a state. They had power. You know, they were like a country. They had a constitution. And at the same time, they were in a state of war. The Muslims were in a state of war. Now, during this period, many people would infiltrate the Muslim community. They would pretend to be Muslims. You know, they would pretend to be Muslims, and then they would leave Islam. They would go to Mecca and start reporting what they saw about the Muslims. And many times they would go back, they would pretend to be Muslims, and this was just to break the ranks of the Muslims. This was to break the new community. It was like espionage, you know. So therefore, at that specific time, the Prophet ordered that apostates should be killed. Because basically these people were like spies at the time. You know, they were infiltrating, trying to destroy the Muslim community from within. So therefore action had to be taken at that time. Now obviously today is much different. You know, things are much different than they were back then. So that's why the issue of apostasy, when you have an apostate today, you don't kill him, because as I said, the situation is much more different. And I'm sure most people would understand why the Prophet would make such a ruling at that specific time. Even look back at European history. Treason was a very bad crime, and they would kill the traitor. So that's effectively it. So basically, when you look at all the evidence, you don't kill apostates. It's quite clear. The hadith that says kill apostates was during a time of war, referring to spies and so forth. So I hope that clarifies the issue.